Thank you, Lou, and thanks for the kind invitation. It's also great to see so many familiar faces, some of which I haven't seen in quite some time. I am going to offer some perspectives that aren't strictly from a company viewpoint. I will reflect on some lessons learned from the Gates Foundation Gavi experience as well as the time in government. I think that the importance of public-private partnerships in, I'll talk about global health, has become abundantly clear to many parties in the past 15 years, but I think we still have gaps. And I also think that there continues to be, particularly in the broader global health community, a level of ideological opposition to true collaboration with the private sector to address the toughest challenges. Now, we have had successes in many areas in response to market failures, and there are three that come to mind for me. The first is biodefense, where, particularly in the US, we have the potential that is recognized by leaders of a low probability but high consequence event that could affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. Then you have the needs of developing countries, where the market opportunities for companies historically had been limited. And so we have a market failure for a different reason. And then you have health emergencies, such as Ebola or pandemic influenza, where, again, the probability in aggregate may be low, but the consequences could be quite high. How exactly do you prepare for that eventuality if you're a government official or if you are a company? These are three examples of market failures that have triggered responses that I think have been quite productive in many cases and have given us some important lessons learned. In the case of biodefense, in the US government, we've seen important legislation passed and the creation of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, which is essentially a central funding and coordination agency for R&D to address biodefense threats. In the case of global health, driven in large part by the Gates Foundation, since 2000, we have seen a proliferation of product development partnerships which are charged with the responsibility of developing one or more products, drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, against neglected diseases or diseases of developing countries. And increasingly in the case of emergency preparedness, we are seeing a renewed sense of ownership of governments to tackle this challenge in a more definitive way. Ambassador Peterson referenced the Coalition for Epidemic Pandemic Innovation, CEPI, which Norway has played a tremendous leadership role in. This is a group that was commissioned in Davos earlier this year. It is co-sponsored by the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the government of Norway, and is driving a process that will lead to recommendations at Davos next year, and in all likelihood, the establishment of an entity that will be charged with addressing the highest priority threats from an epidemic and pandemic standpoint. So when we think about regulatory, the role of regulatory agencies and authorities, it's very important to look at these examples and extract the lessons about interactions between companies and the public sector, and including regulatory authorities. And I'd like to touch on those. First of all, let me just kind of level set here and point out that you can't be prepared for pandemics, you can't address critical global health needs, you can't be prepared for deliberate threats without industry. It is impossible. There is no way that the public sector, even though it will make tremendous investments in R&D, can on its own establish a sustainable framework for innovation that leads to commercialization, that leads to widespread availability of products, which lead to impact. It just hasn't been possible to date, and there is no example on the horizon, even with CEPI, of the public sector doing this alone. And yet we rarely talk about the fact that companies and their products are essential. If you look at the Global Fund or Gavi publications about their successes in terms of lives impacted, they're typically recognizing the important contributions of donors and the important contributions of global health entities, but they rarely, I'm one of the few people I think that can say this, or is willing to say it, they rarely will talk about the importance of companies. But when an emergency happens, like Ebola, everyone depends upon the industry to step forward and innovate, and to do it in record time. And so I just want to, for the record, state what to me is obvious, which is that we have to have this strong collaboration. Now, when it comes to regulatory issues, I think the accountability is shared. It is a joint accountability for safety and efficacy of products for all populations in which they will be used between the person who is administering the product, the practitioner, the entity that is producing the product, the company, the authority that is responsible for evaluating safety and efficacy, the regulatory authority, and then importantly, additional bodies that evaluate benefit risk in specific populations. And here I will highlight the WHO pre-qualification program, as well as in the case of vaccines, the recommending bodies. They're often called the technical advisory groups on immunization, which are comprised of non-conflicted individuals who have subject matter expertise that review the full body of evidence, including health economic evidence, and issue a recommendation on whether that vaccine should be used in a given population. They, I would say, parallel the role of the pre-qualification group at WHO. These four categories of entities share the accountability. Companies take this very seriously. No one, at least the companies that I've had the pleasure of working with in different roles, feel very strongly that they must put patient safety above everything. This is more important in vaccines than almost any other product category, because in vaccines, you are administering something to huge numbers of healthy individuals. So, and you're doing this to protect them against a theoretical threat. You don't know whether an individual will be exposed to an infectious disease, but on the basis of probability, you know that a small proportion of a very big population will. And so you immunize everybody. What this does is it sets the bar for safety very, very high, much higher than, say, an oncology product or a therapeutic for diabetes or hypertension. If you have an adverse event that, quote unquote, only shows up in 1 in 100,000 individuals, you may feel like that is a pretty safe product. But if it's a vaccine that is going to be administered to hundreds of millions of individuals, you can predict that many people will have adverse events. And so this places a special responsibility and, frankly, burden on those who are developing products to very carefully evaluate safety. It means huge trials and very long safety follow-up. So the bar is quite high for industry. What is industry looking for in order to be an effective partner in this arena? One is predictability, understanding what the rules are in order to secure regulatory approval in a given market. Secondly is that the regulatory authority has the capacity necessary to swiftly evaluate safety and efficacy and issue a decision on whether the product will be approved. Thirdly, ideally, some level of convergence of regulatory expectations across authorities. when I was at the Gates Foundation, led by Vincent Ahankai, in the vaccine delivery group, we initiated a African regulatory harmonization effort, which Dan may reference in his remarks. And this stemmed from the recognition that while you can develop a great product and you can even confirm benefit risk at the WHO in a given population, there will always, for the foreseeable future, be a sovereign desire of countries to regulate any product that is given to their people. That may not change substantially in the near future, but if we can get convergence so that there is an agreement across countries, health authorities, on a common set of requirements in a dossier, and that they will swiftly issue approval once those criteria are met, and if they can do that on a regional basis, particularly in African countries where there is limited capacity from country to country, that would be a huge benefit from a product development and expense standpoint for companies. And this is important because you don't want to disincentivize companies to develop products for the individuals in these places. Another lesson, or another expectation, is that in the event of emergencies, that we'll do things differently. We won't sacrifice or compromise quality or safety, but we will expedite processes as quickly as possible. And here, I think a textbook example, which will hopefully be a case study someday, is the FDA's response, and I'm not just saying that because you're here, Lou, but I've heard this from many parties, the FDA's response in the midst of the Ebola crisis. I was not my company was not involved in developing an Ebola countermeasure, but I have spoken with many people who were, and what was remarkable about this response is the level of collaboration between industry parties and the regulators and the normative agencies like WHO, the technical agencies like CDC and NIH, and most importantly, the countries where the outbreak was happening. This was not perfect, to be clear, but from the regulatory standpoint, I think the commitment, the passion of the people inside FDA to this, working day and night to turn around responses to questions and requests, was remarkable. And I think we learned some important lessons. So hopefully next time this happens, and there will be a next time, some of the processes will, some of the lessons learned will be reflected in the processes that we use. On this note, I think it is very important that the global community follow through on Ebola. As I think everyone knows, we've seen a change in the epidemiology in West Africa since the original crisis, and this has made it very difficult for some companies that are developing, particularly vaccines, to demonstrate efficacy of their products. When the epi goes away, you can't demonstrate efficacy in a field setting. And so we need to come up with other ways of licensing these products, even under the equivalent of emergency use. If companies see that in the case of Ebola, everybody expected them to do something significant, redirect resources, take on the opportunity cost of making the Ebola effort, investing in Ebola because it's the right thing to do, but then the community loses interest because the epi changes, this will send a chilling signal to companies that we are counting on to develop vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics for the next emergency. So I think there's a special responsibility on the global community to make sure that we conclude what we started on in this arena. I think I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to just close here by saying that as we go through this conversation today and as the panel thinks about these issues, I really encourage you to look at what is working in this space and the lessons that have been learned. I didn't talk at all about Article 58 in Europe, which is, I think, a fantastic mechanism that the EMA has established that allows regulators in Europe to offer their expertise to inform reviews of products that will not be used in Europe, but will be used to address important diseases in other parts of the world. This is a great example of, it's not money that's going into a public health program, but it's something that is perhaps even better. It's expertise that is being applied to evaluate safety and efficacy for products that will be used elsewhere. And what we at Takeda are seeing with our recently announced polio program is that the level of collaboration between the EMA Article 58 team and the pre-qualification program at WHO, I think helped by the Gates Foundation's encouragement, and of course they're funding us to develop this polio vaccine, has really come a long way. And my expectation is that as we have more of these innovative products for global health, that we'll see an even greater level of collaboration and compression of timelines without sacrificing safety and quality between the processes of the WHO and EMA and the national regulatory authorities. So with that, I will stop there and turn it over to Dan.